Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Indeed it is. Welcome in, and it's showtime for On the Ledger Ontario Politics Podcast. I'm Dave Trafford, and we are recording this on the morning of Thursday, June the 19th. 43rd anniversary today for me and Annie. So we'll probably do something special, like go to Home Depot or whatever, you know. It's kind of what we do. But welcome in. It's good to have you. This is the season finale for On the Ledge. We're going to sort of slow things down for the summer as the legislature takes its lengthy break back after Thanksgiving. So I don't know if we want to get into the merits of that or not, because there's plenty of other stuff to talk about. So let's get around the table here, shall we? Keith Leslie is here joining us from his haunt in Antigenous, Nova Scotia. Kathleen Wynne, former Premier of Ontario. John Wright is our founding veteran pollster, and Tim Hudak is here, a partner at Council Public Affairs. And I think it's just one of those things. Before we go anywhere, can we just get a hands up on anybody who gives two hoots about the Greenbelt today? How many hoots can we get?
Does the hoot go up or down? Like if it's 3 hoots, that's really bad, or is that less?
Is that exciting? I don't know, right? But
hoot and a half, maybe a hoot and a quarter.
Hoot and a quarter?
Yeah.
Well, if it doesn't show up in the polling, it doesn't count, apparently. So,
there's some truth to that, though.
To dismiss government reports, though, and repeated government reports, and this latest one showing, come on, some pretty underhanded stuff in clearly trying to hide records from public access and from reporters and others, university professors looking into what actually happened at the Greenbelt. They clearly went out of their way to make this as difficult to search as possible, using personal device, all these things that we know are wrong. We know someone the chief of staff to former Premier David Peterson went to jail for wiping out hard drives. And here we have the Premier saying no one gives two hoots about this because it doesn't show up in his polling. No one is, not even on my polling at all. So I just don't know how you can have a government literally just not even try to defend its record, just dismiss the reports as nobody cares about this. We can do what we want.
Well, but
I think you meant former Premier McGinty, right?
Did I say?
You said Peterson.
You threw Peterson under the bus.
That's because we were at the Peterson thing.
Because we were at the Peterson event. Yeah. And he would be very upset to learn what you just said.
Oh, God, yes. I'm so sorry about that. I don't know if you want to start that over, Dave, or
no,
just let it stand as my mistake. Okay.
There we go.
I have the.
Yeah, how can we not care about this? And the people I talk to, and I mean, obviously they're going to have a particular bias, but people think that this is still being investigated by the RCMP, and are saying, well, we'll wait and see what the RCMP finds out. But I don't think anybody thinks it's gone away in terms of the Ford's office involvement. Honestly, I don't think they do.
Well, but John, on one level, the Premier's not wrong when he says people don't give two hoots about it, because nobody's talking to me about it just off the top of their head. There are a whole bunch of other things that are top of mind. And we just had an election, and he got reelected running away. So in that context, he's probably right.
Well, he is. And, somebody said to me yesterday, look where the province's numbers are. They must be down because I think he's getting a hit in the polls because of Bill 5. Look, let's put it straight. Within the last few days, there's been a polling done that's been released very credibly by Abacus, showing that while the Premier was ahead by 10 points in May, the party is now ahead by 21 points in June. So from an overall perspective, at 49% support in the province, it's some of the highest numbers you can even count on anywhere by anybody. And his own personal approval is at 44%. So I think, when you get into that kind of territory where you're well above the opposition, you've got a narrative that's striking the chord, because the issue is really about protection against Donald Trump and the integration of the economy with the national economy to keep it ongoing and make sure that you're protected, it makes it very, very difficult for other issues to make it into the top, especially those which are, I dare say, are more local, to the GTA area as opposed to Northern Ontario or Eastern or Central, wherever you want to go. So right now, this government, can afford to Bigfoot some issues. The question is whether or not, they're able to do that at a local level as opposed to, a macro level. Yeah,
Tim, though, this is a pretty good example. And I sent a note out to you guys for kind of hitting the Doug Ford's greatest hits this week because, and it's all happens when he's kind of going off script. And the funny thing about this whole issue around the Greenbelt for me is it only made the headline because of his quote.
The hoot.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Right.
It's the hoot that cut through. The plain and colorful language, and often when he rants, the humor, right, really cuts through. And I've been on the side of I do like ranting Doug Ford. Now you can't have ranting Doug Ford every day or even every week, but once in a while, because it does connect on a level of authenticity, and I think captures the way people talk about issues. That all of you having, and I'll tell you a little bit behind the scenes story too. So, as Premier Wynne will know, and Keith and John too, there's a strategic, communications director or department, what have you, in the Premier's office that meticulously plans out the message of the day, right? Sometimes months in advance. And the hoots or the break-in in the car or the issue around Indigenous leaders, none of that was on script. So they're all pulling their hair out saying, oh my God, the message we planned for is totally sidelined. And then there's others that say, yeah, but he really connected, especially on this crime issue. All of that having been said, the hoots actually cut through. If you had said, people aren't as concerned about this, I'm here because blah, 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 it would have been a non-issue. I do think, though, in the Premier's defense, that it's that the people right now are giving the Premier the benefit of the doubt, as I do. It was a terrible process. It was badly botched. It was a plan that I had actually talked about both as leader of the PC party and as the CEO of AREA, that there's some land in the Greenbelt that is not environmentally sensitive. That could be converted into homes for people to afford quality rental units in exchange, but more environmentally sensitive land into the Greenbelt. That all makes sense to me. But man, when there's no process, no sniff test, no science, no sort of objective arm's length looking at these things or transparency, that's what got them in the mess. And my guess, Dave, is a lot of voters say they screwed up the process. It's not corruption.
Yeah, so I think again the funny thing is he kind of opened the can of worms and just dumped it all over the table and left us all to sort of sift through and pick through the ones that we wanted to focus on. But it was a week of rants, so maybe what we'll do is we'll play the top 40 here for you. And I want to talk both certainly to Kathleen and Tim about the communication strategy, and you'll have some insight on this just because you've been in these scrums forever, Keith. But this was a couple of days ago, and this is at the end of his media event.
Here's my rant. Okay, so first of all, Chief Nish, Chief Demkew, all the chiefs, they're absolute champions. So they do a massive bust. 500 kilos of cocaine that these drug dealers want to poison our kids, poison our people, and 500 kilos. Just imagine that. And they work with the DEA down in the U.S., Drug Enforcement Agency. They work with the Border Patrol. They work with police agencies back and forth. The OPP, Commissioner Creek, is amazing on the Joint Task Force. And guess what, guys? These weak-kneed judges, the biggest bust in Peel's history, guess where they are? They're back out on the street again. Bail. Except one person. Do you believe that? They actually get released on the largest drug bust in Peel's history. 500.
So, and again, back to your point, Tim, yes, I get that. But it kind of, again, captured the headline. It was the weak-kneed judges. He went on to talk about the stupid bandits that tried to steal his car and the cop got chased down by OPP. And you and I were talking about that on John Moore's show this week. So it's just all of that kind of falls into place. But Keith, he was asked, that whole news conference included Mayor Chow. There was a whole bunch of things that were on that. They talked about healthcare. They talked about transit. They talked about all of the things that matter. And when he said he had some kind of a rant that he wanted to bring up, one of the reporters said to him, well, you can tell us the rant now. He says, no. You ask all your questions and then I'll give you my rant. And the point being, you don't get to ask me questions after I rant. And it to me, that's a pretty effective communication tool.
Absolutely. He hijacked his own news conference. As you say, there were several points made, several stories could have been written edited there. And it was Siobhan Morris who had the last, from CTV News, who had the last reporter's question. And she'd already asked one. And he said, I'm going to go on my rant. She will do your rant now and I'll ask my follow-up after. No, thank you. As you said, because he didn't want any questions on that. Because he knows as well, not only is he going to hijack his own news conference, he knows he's going to make headlines talking about weak-kneed judges. And he also knows, and I think, he's bang on. This is one of those read the room situations. And everybody is asking themselves, how did these guys get bail? How do so many people who are out on bail are on bail because they were already on bail when they committed another offense? I mean, it just seems ridiculous that I won't call judges weak-kneed, but it does seem that way too many people are getting bail at a time when most of us would think they should be locked up at least until their court hearing, or at least until a lawyer goes before a judge and makes a case for bail, not just an automatic, your first appearance, you're granted bail right away. That just seems way too generous for most of these criminals or alleged criminals. And I think Premier Ford bang on with it. I think most people actually support him when he goes on a rant like this about why these guys in these high profile drug busts and the tow truck operators, why, the criminal activities going on around the tow truck gangs, the shootings. Why are people being given bail when there's weapons involving guns? All these questions, I think he's bang on with this.
Kathleen, when the whole question, though, around bail, et cetera, criminal code, that falls on the federal desk. So, and time after time after time, the premier has made the point, I'm going to crack down. I'm going to make my point. I'm going to dance on somebody's desk, whatever it might be. And this week he said he was going to do that with the prime minister post G7. He was going to get his update and then hold Prime Minister Carney to account. Post meeting, I didn't hear anything at all about that rant to the prime minister. So at some point, we've got to resolve, because on one hand, the premier not wrong. On the other hand, can we not have or some act on one way or the other, whether it's legislative or just even an acknowledgement that there's a problem?
Well, I think the acknowledgement that there's a problem needs to happen at both levels of government, right? I mean, there are things that Doug Ford has dragged his heels on in terms of appointment of judges and so on. And, I know there's some that have been appointed recently, but there are processes at the provincial level as well as at the federal level. So whether there was a conversation with the prime minister or not, I agree with you, Dave. I mean, I think there needs to be a serious conversation about what needs to be done. But, this is not a serious conversation, standing at a podium ranting about weak-kneed judges. This is dog whistle. This is bait for his base. And, it's his lack of inhibition around interfering with the judicial process. I mean, he loves doing this. He loves calling out the bad guys. I'm putting in air quotes, but he doesn't talk seriously about his role and what he could do. And he doesn't lay out, for example, what he could do is he could lay out all the things that his government is doing to improve the situation and then call on the federal government to do their part. He doesn't do that. He doesn't talk about his responsibility on any of these issues and simply yells at the federal government. So I don't take it as a serious kind of examination of anything, or even a serious proposal in terms of what needs to be done. He's on a tear right now. I don't know what's going on with him, but he's very agitated. And that's just one of the things that he's agitated about. And he knows that it will get a headline, but it has nothing to do with actually solving the problem.
Yeah, Tim, I have this image of Grandpa Simpson screaming at the clouds sometimes, right?
Yeah, well, look, I believe this on balance and then some works for Doug Ford. and especially on this issue of crime. Look at one of the shifts that we saw for Premier Ford, to Premier Wynne's point about appealing to base. It's new Canadian communities particularly that are hit by higher crime rates and higher risk and a feeling that things aren't working. He improved his vote substantially in those areas. Look across the 905 is similarly striving middle class. And, the Albany Club set sitting in Cushing chairs, wishing for the return of cigars in the lounge, right, are not as fussed about increasing crime. I think this actually helps Ford. And that's why one of the reasons why he had an increased voting bloc in 2 consecutive elections. All that having been said, right? You can't call the quarterback sneak every play. You can't do the flea flicker, every possession. You use these tools appropriately. And I think you saw, when Aboriginal leaders are coming to Queen's Park, being invited, into the Church of Democracy for a meeting about Bill 5 and sharing royalties, the rant worked in the opposite direction, which can make that meeting all that much harder.
Yeah, we're going to get to that clip in a minute, but John, to the point of appealing to his base and your notes on polling, sounds like the base is actually fairly solid, and maybe, if to Tim's point, growing. So he can get away with this.
Well, sure he can, for a couple of reasons. Number one is that if you listen to the rant, it doesn't have to appeal to everybody. Clearly, I mean, I always go to the numbers, but which say, look, if you're sailing in at 37% of the public, you've got a majority, and he's well beyond that. But there are a lot of issues that the public focuses on that matter to them at the dinner table and the breakfast table, as opposed to other issues beyond that. And right now, the focus in this country is on the economy, on bread and butter issues about their jobs, the anxiety levels that exist in households about interest rates, all that sort of stuff is there. And so, the premier, he does go on a rant, but in my perspective, it's almost a one-day wonder. And yes, it does appeal to the base, but it appeals to a lot of other people in the moment because they do share those concerns about crime and people being let out on bail. So, I mean, it doesn't have a lasting impact like some of the other issues are. But I will agree with Tim completely on both points. And that, when you say the things that you have about the Indigenous community, the day before 40 of them are going to show up in your office to talk about a very controversial bill, it may reflect, the views of many within your constituency about the handout as opposed to the hand up and all that sort of stuff. It may be acceptable, but tactically, strategically, and otherwise to the issue of the day, it's not helpful. So I would suggest that a lot of this bounces off the public and they kind of go, well, that's just Doug Ford. Plus, he's got other issues that he's winning on, whether it be about Trump and the economy that I'm with him on. And the macro issues are really important to me as opposed to the micro issues specifically. But, to Tim's point, you have to take most of what he says as reflections of, what common day people are concerned about. But there are times when, in fact, he says things which may tactically cause a problem for him within the near future.
Well, Keith, even within that context of that news conference and in the context of that rant, that issue around weak-kneed judges wasn't the only thing. I mean, he actually reflected on that attempted robbery at his home.
Now, I'm going to tell you a story. Probably get in trouble for this. You want to hear about stupid criminals? Have you ever seen that show about stupid criminals out there? So 4 thugs come racing down my street, masks on, ready to take the car out of the driveway. Surprise, surprise, at 12:30, the 2 police cars are there. The chase is on. So they chase him. One guy runs out, takes off. They capture him, and they catch these other guys. But just imagine all the unfortunate people that don't have security there at their house with masks on, and they had all the tools ready to break in and everything. And guess what's going to happen? They're going to be back out. Why don't you guys come over for a barbecue tonight? I'll take care of you better than the police. And thank God the police got you, and I never did. Anyways, that's my...
So, I mean, even there, where he has personalized that story, and there is the communications genius around this, whether you agree with the strategy or not. He's made this, he's the victim now.
Absolutely. And if it can happen to the premier of the province, it can happen to anybody. And he's very, very right. Most of us will not have 2 OPP or 2 OPP vehicles or officers. I'm not sure what those vehicles or officers outside there. He's right. They're pretty stupid criminals to have picked a house that actually has men in vehicles outside the residence. I mean, good God. But the thought of anyone seeing masked men running into their house after midnight is terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. Even if you do happen to have security officers or police officers outside, just think of how you feel targeted and vulnerable and that kind of thing. So again, Dave, you talked about his genius in the messaging on this. It's made him the victim, but he didn't really play it as a victim card. He's just pointing it out. I think his message here is, if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone, and we have to crack this stuff down. We have to come down hard and stop this nonsense. I mean, masked men going into homes to get the car keys, threatening families with children, all this kind of stuff, basically just to rob a vehicle for the most part. It's insanity. And it really does need, again, I think this is one of those where the premier's reading the room, but making him the victim in this, as you say, he's not really portraying himself as a victim just so much as an example of how this is just too widespread and it has to be dealt with.
Yeah, well, again, I think the idea, inviting them over for a barbecue because he'll treat them better than anybody else will.
But Dave, so if I can just say,
yeah,
there is no doubt that the man has a gift for communication, and he certainly has a certain, I'm going to say, appeal to a certain segment of the population who think he's funny, and and that's great. All that is really good, but if what I'm looking for in a leader is a serious person who is going to lay out a problem for me and help me understand how he's going to work to resolve it, I never get that from Doug Ford. That doesn't happen. And so, fine. The bar is that low. And we've talked about this before. Oh, well, that's just Doug. Okay. If we're okay with that, and the polling numbers are great now, excellent. They'll be great until they're not. And he'll be riding high until he's not. And fine. I hope he enjoys it. That's great. But are real issues being resolved? I would suggest to you not. I'd suggest to you that there are all sorts of things, and we're going to talk about some of them this morning, that are not being resolved. People are very concerned, as you've all said, about other issues. But that doesn't mean that feeding the narrative that we live in a lawless society, which I'll just have to say, I was at an event last night, a Pride event in Hamilton, with people who have escaped Nigeria and Kenya and Uganda, LGBTQ members. There were, there are 200 people who are part of this group, and to frame Ontario and Canada as lawless societies in the context of places like that, it's ridiculous. But that's what he's doing, and he wants people to believe that they are all at risk. And I am not minimizing the dangers that people confront. I understand that. But then show me what you're going to do to solve those problems. Don't stand in a parking lot and yell about you being a victim. You are sitting in the premier's chair. You have a lot of levers to pull, and if you don't pull them, then that's on you.
As we record this, in a few hours, the premier is set to sit down with, I think it's 40 chiefs from the province. And of course, Bill 5, Ring of Fire, will be on that agenda. And I think in yesterday's avail with the media, the question came up, and they wanted him to clarify what was going to happen and when the meeting was. And so he went on and accommodated the media and kind of spelled it out. And this is what we're going to be talking about. And I thought, for the most part, the opening was pretty good.
There's an opportunity of a lifetime for him. Again, we're giving them $3 billion with a B, $3 billion to be equity partners to make their communities more prosperous and wealthier, and have services they've never had before. A lot of these communities, vast majority, are living on diesel throughout the winter. They don't even have roads. They don't get fresh fruit. So this is going to change their lives. And then on top of it, we're going to give them $70 million for training, similar like the Skills Development Fund, to train up their community. And then the last one is $10 million for scholarships. And wouldn't it be great if a young Indigenous person goes out and gets a free scholarship ride and becomes whatever, engineer, lawyer, doctor, whatever they decide to do.
And that would have been great if he'd just said, and that's what we're going to talk about when the Chiefs sit down with me tomorrow. But he kept going.
This is like handing an opportunity on a silver platter to First Nations that by the way, I have treated like gold. And over again, the chiefs, national chiefs, the regional chiefs, other chiefs have told me we've never had more access to a premier ever, as long as they can remember. So like I tell Rickford all the time, I should be the Minister of Indigenous Affairs because I get calls every single day. And when I first came into office, I told Minister Rickford, treat them well, give them what they need, whatever they want for them to prosper. But there's going to be a point that you can't just keep coming hat in hand all the time to the government. You got to be able to take care of yourselves. And when you literally have gold mines, nickel mines, every type of critical mineral that the world wants, and you're saying, no, I don't want to touch that. By the way, give me money. Not going to happen.
That might be 55 seconds he wants back, Tim.
Yeah. And so I'm sure there's been a lot of discussion yesterday and this morning with the Premier and, trusted advisors, especially on communications, on how to walk that back. So I think the rant worked very well on crime. The Premier, Wynne, and I are on a very different page on that. But like I said, you can't go that playbook every time. And here it certainly has backfired. Now, I think that if you survey the audience probably in Ontario, there would be many who would say, yeah, there's too much dependency. The current system is badly broken. They would also say we've betrayed Indigenous populations. We've undermined the social fabric of the culture. We have to change. But that wasn't the way to say it. And it's like inviting somebody into your house and then insulting them before they even get in the door. At the end of the day, I still remain optimistic. I know, to her credit, Premier Wynne, I think with Minister Gravel, did arrange, some a system for Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario. They would get a share of resource revenue, part of the mining tax the province brings in. When gold prices, for example, are very high, Ontario makes a lot of money right off the top. They should be shared with Indigenous populations in proximity across the province as a whole. It's something I champion in my time in politics. I hope the Premier takes that one up.
Yeah, John, the whole question of, again, going off script is one thing, but sometimes people will say, believe people when they show you who you are, and when Ford goes down that hole, I don't know that it's just as easy to say he's appealing to his core. There's something fundamental that he believes in terms of how he's talking about the First Nations and their relationship with the province.
When you do polling for as long as I have, you don't just talk about the numbers and make comments on the radio about stuff. You learn a lot about public discourse and the interaction of individuals and how issues come about. What I learned a long time ago, many, many years ago, was that there are 3 stages to how issues develop and have an impact. And I call them ripples, waves, and tides. The ripples are kind of there on, that you can see, but they're disparate. They're not really having much of an impact. It might be a local issue. It might be, a mayor in a town that says something and it has some response to it, or there's a few issues that are out there. The next one is a wave. And that's where a constituency, in fact, brings to bear a fair bit of impact on what your agenda is going to be. And that's what we're witnessing right now. We're witnessing the response to how a process was shaped, how many people wanted to be at the table to talk about a particular bill, and how a constituency wasn't consulted with in a proper way. And this is what we're dealing with. I think there's a bigger issue coming, and that is the tide. We have a bill which has been big-footed, and I think behind the scenes, you're not only going to have the Indigenous groups and the First Nations groups who are going to be at the doorstep as they are today, but we have a lot of others who suddenly believe that with a majority government, with the government riding as high as it is in the polls, has basically got the opportunity in a very forceful way to designate your town, your city, your area as an economic zone. And basically you have no input. You're done, finished. And I think what you're starting to see behind the scenes is the coalition beginning to build. Now it's not out in the open, but there's also, I think, a sense of punitive nature that governments can visit upon those groups that stand up and say something. And so I think, they'll be very, very careful. But I think we're at a bit of a tipping point as we head into this summer period, that if there are going to be occupations or if there's going to be disruption, the next thing that you may have are all of the other groups that have been left outside of this process, who believe that they're threatened by a particular bill or by a particular government, who see it not just as an opportunity, but as an obligation to represent their constituents and start to join forces. And I think that's the tide that we may be starting to feel a bit now that's coming, that the government won't be able to avoid. So it may not take away from their overall popularity in the public opinion polls, but from a strategic and a tactical point of view, as I said, it really can become an issue where you have many, many, many constituent groups who are of very different nature forming, opposition to something because they fear that it's undemocratic, that they will have no control over what is visited upon them. And I think we're kind of at the beginning stages of that.
Yeah, Keith, again, if he had just stuck with the first 45 seconds and left it at that, and this is what we're going to talk about, because that was all relatively positive in terms of what he was able to say we're going to put on the table. That last minute, he almost gave away all of his leverage in any kind of credible conversation with the Chiefs, no?
Certainly undid any goodwill that he might have built up. As he said, he's treated them like gold. Okay. But then, saying hat in hand and give me money without development. No, don't, we're not going to be doing. It was just a harsh, needless reminder of the situation, the way many, many people do view this situation, that they're coming hat in hand, as opposed to viewing it that, he mentioned that there so many of these First Nations communities are still on diesel. Well, why is that? He's offering them $3 billion for development of, the Ring of Fire and these other projects. Why haven't we spent the kind of money, and the federal government as well? I know there's both federal and provincial responsibilities here, but they point fingers at each other instead of getting our First Nations communities out of third world conditions, getting them off diesel, getting them into, hooking them up to the electricity grid, getting roads. I know it's not always possible. There's huge negotiations that have to go on. But we're watching government here saying, we're going ahead with this development. Those minerals are coming out of the ground on your territory, whether you like it or not. Here's $3 billion. We can work on this. It's a lifetime opportunity of a lifetime. Well, some of the First Nations are viewing this as longer than their lifetime span, and they've already seen what's gone on, with the poisoning of the mercury poisoning. They don't want to see this, these sorts of things happen elsewhere. They're very concerned. It's not just about the money for them. It's about more than a lifetime. It's about 7 lifetimes, as they think. So you're coming at this from a very different perspective. And knowing this, your governments know this as well. But then to say what he said in that last half of that little rant, it just undid any goodwill. And we already heard the chief say, it's just, they called it racist. They called it insulting. They've already feeling this way about a bill where they were not consulted when they should have been beforehand. Now he's going into consulting them after it's already been forced through the legislature, rammed through, without any public hearings, essentially one day. And yet, where are they? How are they going to fight back against this? They're going to go in there already pissed off. And so I don't think he did himself any good whatsoever there. And I'm really curious to see what Premier Wynne has to say on this, because she's a former minister in this, and she knows a heck of a lot more about it than I do.
Well, the interesting part about this, again, as we're recording this, the meeting is to come in a few hours. But and Kathleen, I'll let you respond to this, but I think we have to actually acknowledge the fact that Salma Makwa, came out and made a statement and, talked about it being deeply offensive and racist. He accused the premier of perpetuating colonial attitudes, skirting treaty obligations. He's trying to create divisions in our province and is taking us back. And the reaction to Saul's comments I'm hearing is, well, that's bloody typical. So it only creates more divisiveness. And there's an unwillingness to actually appreciate the fact that what Saul is saying has some credibility.
Absolutely. I mean, this relationship is a mess, Dave. I mean, when Doug Ford says, so, you're talking about the last few seconds of his announcement. I can point to the language that he used at the beginning. He talked about giving to them. He wasn't talking government to government, and then he talked about handouts in the last few seconds. Having 40 chiefs come to talk. I don't know how long the meeting's going to be, but unless it's many, many hours, 40 chiefs are not going to have a chance to speak to the premier, to talk about the fact that he's got, the best relationship with the Indigenous community of any premier. I mean, I just don't believe it. It's just not true. And you know, to put this legislation in place, pass it quickly, and then have the meeting afterwards about what's in it. I mean, it's nonsense in terms of building trust and relationships with the Indigenous community and with First Nations particularly. So I think John is very, very wise in terms of what's going on right now, and the people who are looking at the way this premier behaves and looking at what this government's doing. And you know, there's a whole sort of body of evidence building up that the premier himself really doesn't understand a lot of the things he talks about. And I'm not saying that in a I don't mean to be demeaning. I just mean that I don't think that this premier has spent a lot of time going to First Nations communities, finding out what's actually going on. I don't think that he actually knows that when you talk about the money that needs to, and I agree with Tim. I mean, we were working on resource revenue sharing with First Nations. It was a very difficult conversation, but to suggest that putting some money on the table solves all the issues around permitting of mines, around education concerns on reserve, in terms of health. And I'm telling you, I sat for 2 years with the 9 First Nations in the Matawa First Nations in the Ring of Fire area. And yes, we were talking about mining and we were talking about road building, but we were also talking about all those other issues, because those are the things that are affecting people immediately in their lives every day. And unless those are dealt with, it doesn't matter how much money you put on the table for a road. It's not going to get built because those other issues haven't been dealt with. So I think, bottom line, those comments betray a really deep lack of understanding of how these relationships have to be built.
Tim, and you are the eternal optimist on almost every subject we talk about. So I want to come back to you on this, just because.
Not the Leafs, not the Maple Leafs. Draw the line somewhere, Dave.
Draw the line.
Great line.
I hear you. And to John's point, and again, as we record this earlier this morning, you know, there was a letter published by former mayors of Toronto, Sewell, Hall, Crombie. I think Ann Golden signed on to that as well. And it was basically talking about, hang on, we got to have a sober second thought, sober second look at what Bill 5 actually does. And, you know, it was put to, I think John Sewell was on the radio this morning talking about it. Yeah, maybe the horse is out of the barn, but it doesn't stop us from kind of making sure that we have some attention paid to the issues that we've described. And it's going beyond the First Nations issues right now. To John's point, it is starting to become more of a local issue. So in one hand, it's easy to dismiss it because it's happening over there. But collectively, I still think that there's a danger here for the Ford government, and to some degree the Carney government, that this is going to be a really difficult summer for both of them.
Yeah, okay, I'll bet you. No, like, it's got to say it. John Sewell's on the outside of me. I'm pretty comfortable with where I'm standing than this issue and
True that.
the others. But look, maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. It is framework legislation. They'll consult on the regulations. I just think that the barometer on Doug Ford and his government tends to self-correct. They can make mistakes. They can run headlong towards a cliff, but then they stop and run the opposite direction. And the fact that we see the government of Nova Scotia, you mentioned Prime Minister Carney, and British Columbia, you know, heading in very similar directions. I do believe that Canadian public opinion is significantly behind extraordinary measures to just get things built again, whether that's affordable housing, highways and transit, you know, mines and new factories. So maybe you're right, but I think that just based on the behavior, the culture of the Ford government, the reasonableness that will usually come to the surface, and the fact that we do have to shake things up, I think it's going to work out.
This week, when the G7 was meeting here in Canada, the premiers for the eastern provinces, at least, were down in Boston, John, and I thought it was an interesting sort of juxtaposition of seeing how the conversation at Kananaskis was all focused on what the hell's Trump going to do next. But there was some real, I think, substantive conversations, at least between some of the governors and the premiers here in Canada, in Massachusetts.
Yeah, let me frame that by a quick reflection on the G7 situation. I think it was brilliantly executed. I think people keep saying, well, at some point, the prime minister is going to fall, prey to those who want to stop him, put sand in the gears. He's not politically astute. He's never done this sort of thing before. The way in which the G7 and then the wider group unfolded was absolutely brilliant. And part of that was the juxtaposition for a moment when Donald Trump left the room. Okay, so he goes. What do we end up with? Mark Carney standing with all of the other world leaders, individuals that we want to have a trading relationship with, all of those people that he has personal relationships with. I mean, the warmth between the Italian prime minister, the Mexican prime minister, even those individuals who, have some conflict with this country, his ability to network and pull people together is astounding. And to pull all of that off, even in the final moments of the press conference, right at the very end, his ability to do two things, to say, you know what, let me ad lib a question that you haven't asked. What was the tone like in the room? And then have them eating out of his hand at the end to applaud. Again, just stunning to see an adult in the room dealing with all of this stuff. And we're not talking about, different colored socks. It's brilliant. Then you move over to where the premiers are. The discussions are happening at the levels where they have to happen. In many ways, sometimes process is more, just as important or more important than the substance. We know what the substance is, but the ability for the premiers, particularly in Ontario, to meet with people, to keep the discussion going, to make sure that it's not overshadowed by all the other things that are happening in the United States. I mean, the governor of New York is clearly drawing the line in the sand with the Trump administration to say, you know what, we're kind of going to go war with you on a whole bunch of fronts. To be wedged into that atmosphere with our issues. Again, I got to give both the premiers and the prime minister an A+ for a week that's taken place on the most important and crucial issues to this country. And I there's no reason why the prime minister isn't at 54% of approval ratings and the premier where he is at. So all the issues we talk about today are really important to the province. But on the big issues, I think the strategy, you can see it all meshing together, whether coordinated or not. And it's a new page that's being turned for this country. It'll be very, very interesting to see how it remains throughout the summer.
Kathleen, last week when we met, we all kind of we were on the edge thinking this was going to be probably one of the more significant G7 summits in terms of what would come out of it. And, I'm watching the breathless attention that the media on the scene is paying attention to what's going on. And they almost felt like they were disappointed because we didn't have the big trade announcements and we didn't have the big noise from Trump and all those sorts of things. But to John's point, I was talking to somebody about this a couple of days ago, and I said, the interesting thing for me is Carney went into that knowing full well and stating full well that we are in a place where we are resetting our economic, cultural relationship with the United States. The other side of that coin is we're doing the same thing with everybody else who was at that meeting.
Yeah, exactly.
Correct.
Right. And people laughed and said, well, Canada can never be an economic superpower. And that might be true. But based on the relationship that he's now forging with other countries like the UK and France and Australia, et cetera, that group can certainly overcome and overwhelm what's going on with the chaos in the United States, or at least, be preventative in terms of shielding yourself from whatever chaos might be coming out of the White House. So I think that's the significant thing for me that came out of it.
So to have a prime minister in Canada who can be a facilitator, who can actually create an environment where those relationships can be built, I think it's great. And I think anticlimactic is just fine. If the media is not happy, that's okay. I was a bit worried when Trump looked like he was storming out, but he didn't storm out. He just left, and that's fine. It gave a chance for another conversation. So I think Prime Minister Carney did the very best that we could have expected, and I believe that I believe that the path in terms of our relationship with all of the countries that were there and with the United States is in a better place than it was before this meeting.
Tim, it's interesting. It was a piece in the Globe today that talked about the number of communiques, and there was this sense that because Trump wasn't there and they watered down some language vis-a-vis Ukraine, that the G7 couldn't come to any kind of an agreement. But they spelled it all out. And I didn't know this until I read it this morning, but there were 7 different communiques. They contained 130 collective, precise, future-oriented, and politically obligatory commitments. So there was a good deal of, work done and accomplished at this that was under the radar, but as Kathleen says, that's probably not a bad thing considering where we've been.
Somebody's just needling me about 10 minutes ago about being the optimist. and too often replay the tape back to February, March. Yeah, I just think that the particularly the U.S. relationship, the economic and cultural ties are so long and deep that not even disruption of Donald Trump can stop trends. And certainly I think Prime Minister Carney has sensed the moment and done a masterful job of using the moment to benefit all Canadians. It's very encouraging to hear. We'll see. But a deal within 30 days or so, right? It's all heading in the proper direction. And if Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, inked a deal, that's table stakes for Canada. I have no doubt we'll be above that. I'll push the optimism a bit further. We've signed what I think 15 different trade agreements with 50 plus different countries over the last 15 or 20 years. So maybe slightly off my math, but our integration with the American economy and share of exports has actually gone up. I think that trend is going to continue. I think at the end of the day, we're actually more closely integrated in North America than less.
Yeah, but do you think we're not, by seeing what we had occur at the G7, it's insulating us from any kind of capricious president, whether it's Trump or not? Doesn't mean we don't do business with them, but we do business with them more on our terms.
Oh, the Americans?
Yeah.
I think that is interesting, and that is a point, but I don't think it is as the major point. I think what actually is working the most is that Americans now starting to push back against the president. And to his credit, Premier Ford did an outstanding job of being that sort of voice of how both countries can benefit, came across well to Americans. Prime Minister Carney now down that path, meeting the premiers of Eastern Canada with their governor counterparts, like all of that is sort of bubbling up, and I think is now pulling things back well from the edge. I still think there'll be tariffs. There'll be a base level of tariffs, but the larger degree that we're inside of that wall, that's going to benefit Canada and attract a lot of other investment to have access through Canada to the U.S. market.
Yeah, Keith, to John's analogy, we may be seeing that tide start to swell south of the border, is when we've got the U.S. governors and the Canadian premiers sort of standing in lockstep.
Absolutely. I mean, Premier Ford described it as a love-in. I know that's probably a bit optimistic, but what we're seeing there is the type of ground level meetings that have to continue between governors and premiers, the Canadian and the U.S. governments, if at the federal level, they're not talking, at least at the state level. And they get along really, really well. And the importance of tourism to these U.S. states, New England states in particular, of Canadian tourism, it's massive. And both sides, this is really hurting both sides. So I think it's an indication that even if they have to keep these up for 4 years of Trump, that these sorts of meetings will continue to be focused on the good parts of our relationship and how to strengthen them, even in the face of Trump and his tariffs. Looking at the G7, I thought, whether Prime Minister Carney can make Canada, an economic superpower, I'm not so sure, but he's certainly making Canada an important player on the world stage, especially in the Trump era. And I think that's crucial. And that was one of the big things that came out of the G7 for me. The one moment where I thought Trump was trying to hijack things early on was when he started talking about the G8 and how Russia should really be here. And I thought, okay, he's trying to stir up a little bit here. But I think it was the German chancellor who just said to him, we don't have warmongers, warlords, or war criminals at this table for a reason. That's why he's not here. So I thought that was really good as well. I mean, the world is pushing back against Trump publicly, and he seemed to take it. He seemed to accept it for the most part. I mean, he left early, but as Kathleen pointed out, he didn't storm out. He just left. And I think that made for a much better second day of G7 for everybody, because there was no, chasing the Trump headline or the Trump craziness. There was, let's just focus and see what can done. And apparently, I mean, if there was that many 7 communiques with that many productive and active things that have to be, politically acted on, that's pretty remarkable achievement for a first-time prime minister at a G7. So well done.
Yeah, John, the idea of Trump's departure, I mean, under the guise of what's the crisis that's going on in the Middle East with Iran and Israel, I think that's legitimate in terms of where the president needed to be at that point. But to Keith's point, I'm wondering whether or not, back to the tone in the room, whether there just wasn't this great sigh of relief. Okay, we're glad we're through that, and now we can kind of get down to business.
Well, it may well have been. Who knows? Mark Carney, as he said at the end, let me ad lib the question. What was the tone like in the room? Just go back. It was brilliant. It was just brilliant. Let me step back again from years of taking a look at this scene and just saying the following. I remember when Prime Minister Trudeau went to Davos for the first time, and John Manley was the representative there, and the stories that came out about it where Mr. Manley sort of said to the Prime Minister, these are the most important issues that are going to be on the table today. And the person that the Prime Minister had come with, who was someone from his office, leaned forward to the Prime Minister and said, those are important issues, Prime Minister, but they're not domestic ones. And I always got the sense that the former Prime Minister, played to the domestic lens. Like it was always kind of like, I'm going to get there and talk about my issues as opposed to integrating with the global issues. Like it always, whether it be about gender parity or other things, it was always seen through that lens. The greatest power in the world, whether it in your personal life or in politics, is the power of choice. That's it. I mean, to Tim's point, we're 74% integrated into the United States economy now, as we were at the beginning of the first Trump administration. Nothing has really changed, but the propellant of that is scope. The propellant of that is the desire to reach out and either rekindle and with a motive, but also to ensure that you've got those relationships with other countries and you've got the sense that you're part of a global community. I have to say, this is the first time 2 things have become apparent to me in the last couple of days. The first time that we've brought together, it wasn't without Trump standing there. That picture is so important where the Prime Minister said, we're at a hinge moment. And we're going to reach out to see if we can have choice, we can have relationships. And Tim, you may be right. At the end of the day, it may mean that we are even greater integrated on certain areas. But whether it be about arms or defense or about other issues, we're opening the door to possibilities in trade relationships. But the other thing is, if you take a look at the committee that was looking at Bill C-5, that mirrors what the Trump that the Ontario government was dealing with in their Bill 5. You even saw conservatives applauding the Liberal government by saying that the Liberal government had accepted, dozens of amendments that the Conservatives didn't expect to even get through. So we are in a different space than we were before. And whether it's because of the pressure or the hinge or the person themselves who's arrived on the scene, I just think it's got potential. But I would say that we have to see where this goes throughout the summer and whether the momentum is there, because at some point the rubber has to hit the road. But right now the car's being built, the tires are being put on it. It'll be fascinating to see how much mileage we get out of all of this work ahead of time.
Well, let's leave that there because there's things to look forward to. And as noted off the top, this is our season finale for On the Ledge. So we'll take a bit of a breather while the summer months carry on. And again, just a heads up, if all hell breaks loose and there's some reason we need to convene the Avengers here, we'll do our best to do that.
It could be right after the meeting.
It could be tomorrow. Who knows? But in the meantime, Kathleen Wynne, the honorable Tim Hudak, John Wright, Keith Leslie, thanks again for contributing to the show. And looking forward to hearing all your stories about what I did on my summer vacation when next we meet. So, thank you again. All right. That'll do it for us. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford. And again, if you're watching this on the YouTube, make sure you hit subscribe. And if you're listening on Apple, Spotify, and whatever iHeart. Yeah, those are the other apps. Make sure you hit the subscribe button there, and this will just land it. And again, if there's something comes up over the summer where we're going to have a call an audible and have another show, an unscheduled one, it will just land in your inbox and you'll get it without any kind of effort. All right, so that'll do it for us. In the meantime, I hope you all get to enjoy what I think might be a pretty interesting Canada Day in this part of the world. And thanks for being here. I'm Dave Trafford. It is On the Ledge, your Ontario politics podcast for Story Studio Network.
I have a YouTube channel right here, as you can all people see. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content. Look at this. Bye now.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.